Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt as if time itself whispered a forgotten secret? Every faded frame carries not just an image, but an untold story, sometimes heartwarming, sometimes terrifying, and often more shocking than fiction. Imagine a young miner in South Africa during the 1,950 seconds. At the end of every grueling shift, he is forced to stand under an X-ray machine, his thin body scanned from head to toe, not for his health, but to make sure he hasn't swallowed a diamond. To the owners of the mines, his dignity meant nothing compared to the glitter of precious stones. Or picture three little girls in America, 1929, wearing handmade Halloween costumes. They look innocent at first glance, until you realize how strangely frightening those crude masks appear, revealing how different the world once was. These are not staged scenes. They are real fragments of history, frozen in time, daring us to look closer. And once you do, your view of the past will never be the same. So, are you ready to step into these forgotten moments? Let's begin. The Diamond Mine X-ray, South Africa, 1,950 seconds. In the heart of South Africa's Kimberley mines during the 1,950 seconds, young men descended each day into the Earth's darkness. Their bodies were covered in dust, their lungs heavy with the air of stone and sweat. Yet, the hardest part of their shift came not underground, but above it. At the end of each day, miners lined up silently, waiting for something more dehumanizing than the endless hours of labor. Mandatory X-ray scans. They weren't searching for disease or broken bones, they were searching for diamonds. Owners feared that workers would smuggle the precious stones by swallowing them, hiding them deep inside their bodies. And so, the human body itself became the last checkpoint of suspicion. Imagine the fear of a boy barely older than 16, exhausted from hours of brutal labor, standing before a cold machine that treated him like a criminal. One wrong move, one hidden speck of brilliance in his stomach, and his life could be destroyed. These images remind us that behind every glittering gem displayed in luxury shops today, there were once shadows of pain, fear, and exploitation. The shine of wealth, for some, was built on the suffering of the unseen. Halloween in 1929, strange faces of innocence. The year was 1929. In America, Halloween was already a celebrated tradition, but it looked nothing like the glossy, commercial holiday we know today. Instead of store-bought costumes with bright colors and polished designs, children often made their disguises at home, piecing together scraps of fabric, paper, or anything they could find. That October night, three little girls posed for a photograph in their handmade costumes. At first, the scene seems innocent, children smiling, celebrating, preparing for candy and games. But look closer, and the masks tell a different story. Crude, hollow eyes and distorted mouths gave their costumes an eerie, almost ghostly presence. What was meant to be playful turned unsettling, as if these children had stepped out of a nightmare instead of a party. This was Halloween during a different era, raw, unpolished, and strangely haunting. These masks weren't designed to charm or impress, they were meant to frighten, and in those times, they succeeded. When we compare them with today's cheerful costumes, we realize how culture has reshaped even the way we express fear and fun. The past holds mirrors that both fascinate and disturb us, and this photo is one of them. Titanic survivors signing autographs. April 2012. April 1912, the night the unsinkable ship met its icy fate. More than 1,500 lives were lost, and the survivors who stepped onto land carried not only trauma, but an odd, heavy spotlight. Imagine this: a woman, her hands still trembling from the cold Atlantic, approached by strangers not with comfort, but with curiosity. Someone hands her a notebook, a pen asking for her autograph. She is no actress, no singer, no politician. She is simply a survivor of the Titanic. Yet in that moment, survival itself had turned her into a kind of celebrity. It feels almost surreal. Behind her eyes may still linger the cries of families torn apart, the terror of lifeboats lowering into black waters. But to the public, she was a living witness to history, someone who had touched the edge of death and returned. People wanted proof of that encounter, written in ink. This single photo captures a strange truth. Tragedy can transform ordinary people into unwilling symbols. Survivors were treated like stars, even as they carried scars no one could see. The Titanic's sinking was not only the end of a ship, but the beginning of countless haunting stories, stories etched into faces, and sometimes into autographs. Child labor in the cotton mills, USA, 1908. In the early 20th century, the hum of machinery echoed endlessly inside America's cotton mills. Among the rows of spindles and threads stood not only adult workers, but children, some no taller than the machines they operated. One haunting photograph from 1908 shows a young girl, her small frame nearly swallowed by the towering looms. Her face is weary, her eyes far older than her years. She should have been playing outside, chasing dreams, or learning in school. Instead, she was bound to the rhythm of the factory bell, her childhood exchanged for survival. Child labor was not a hidden tragedy, it was common practice. Families struggling in poverty had no choice but to send their children to work. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in air thick with cotton dust that scarred lungs and stunted growth. There were no safety nets, no protections, only the harsh demand of production. This single image speaks louder than statistics. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that behind the progress of an industrializing nation stood children robbed of innocence. Their small hands kept the wheels of industry turning, but at a cost history can never fully repay. A glimpse of Tokyo's café culture, Japan, 1970 secondes. Tokyo in the 1970 seconds was a city caught between tradition and modernity. Neon lights flashed across crowded streets, while tucked away in quieter corners were small, intimate cafes, places where culture quietly evolved. In one such cafe, a photograph captures a waitress entertaining a customer. At first, it seems like a simple, everyday moment. But this was no ordinary cafe. Here, the interaction between waitresses and customers was warm, playful, and far less formal than typical Japanese service at the time. Guests weren't just served tea or coffee, they were given a feeling of companionship, a brief escape from the rigid routines of daily life. Looking back, this image feels almost prophetic. These cafes, with their friendly atmosphere and attention to customer experience, became prototypes for what Japan is famous for today: themed cafes, including the iconic maid cafes that blend hospitality with performance. It's fascinating to see how one ordinary snapshot holds the seed of a cultural trend. What seemed like casual interaction in the 1970 seconds was, in reality, the quiet beginning of a phenomenon that would charm millions worldwide. Ron Storm, the man who played women, the 6th of August, 1970. A candid photograph shows actor Ron Storm in a moment most people would never expect, sitting in the toilet, relaxed, almost careless. At first glance, it may seem like just another strange snapshot from the past, but Ron Storm himself was far from ordinary. He was a performer best known not for playing men, but for portraying women. At a time when traditional roles were still deeply entrenched in British theatre and television, Ron Storm carved a space for himself by stepping across that boundary. His performances were bold, humorous, and sometimes provocative, a reflection of a society slowly opening up to new forms of entertainment and expression. The photo captures the raw, unfiltered side of a man who lived in between roles. Out on stage, he embodied female characters with wit and charm. Off stage, he was still just Ron, a man navigating fame, laughter, and the public eye. It's a reminder that history isn't only shaped by kings, queens, or wars. Sometimes it is carried forward by performers who dared to blur the lines, challenging what was considered acceptable. Ron Storm's story is one such fragment of cultural rebellion. Liberation at Dachau, a guard dog defeated, 1945. The year was 1945. The gates of Dachau, one of Nazi Germany's most infamous concentration camps, finally swung open as Allied forces arrived. For years, this place had been a factory of despair where prisoners were stripped of dignity, freedom, and often life itself. Among the photographs taken in those first days of liberation, one stands out: a group of freed prisoners beating a German guard dog. To the unknowing eye, it looks brutal, but to those who lived through Dachau, it was a moment charged with years of pent-up fear, rage, and survival. These dogs had been more than animals. They were weapons of terror, trained to enforce silence, obedience, and hopelessness. Their barks were often the prelude to punishment. For the prisoners, the dogs symbolized the constant threat of violence that haunted every breath they took. So when freedom finally came, the act of striking down the beast was not just vengeance, it was symbolic. It marked the collapse of an entire system of cruelty. It was the reclaiming of power by those who had been powerless for so long. This single frame reminds us, liberation is not only about open gates, it is also about breaking the chains of fear, one symbol at a time. The Lawson family portrait, Smiles Before Darkness, 1929. At first glance, it looks like any ordinary family photograph. A father, a mother, and their children stand together, dressed in their Sunday best, their faces calm and proud. If you didn't know the story, you might think this was just another happy family from rural America in the late 1920s. But this image hides a nightmare waiting to unfold. The man standing second from the right is Charlie Lawson, the patriarch. Only days after this photograph was taken, he would shock the entire nation by committing an unthinkable act, murdering his wife and 6 of his 7 children before taking his own life. No one could have predicted such horror from this picture alone. That's what makes it so haunting. The children smile faintly, unaware of the fate awaiting them. The mother's quiet expression gives no hint of the tragedy that would soon erase her future. This photograph has since become one of the most chilling family portraits in American history. It forces us to confront a disturbing truth. Behind even the most ordinary smiles, darkness can sometimes lurk unseen. Laughter in the trenches, French soldiers, 1940. War is a place of fear, exhaustion, and endless waiting. But even on the front lines, soldiers found ways to cling to fragments of joy. In 1940, on the Maginot Line, a curious scene unfolded. A group of French soldiers dressed as women, performing for their comrades. It wasn't meant to deceive, it was meant to heal. With wigs fashioned from scraps and makeshift dresses, these men stepped out of their uniforms and into roles that made their brothers-in-arms burst into laughter. For a few brief hours, the roar of artillery was replaced by cheers and applause. This strange yet heartwarming photograph reminds us that humor is not a luxury, but a survival tool. For soldiers trapped in endless mud and misery, laughter became as vital as food or water. It allowed them to feel human, to momentarily forget the weight of death surrounding them. Behind the absurd costumes lay something profound, the courage to fight despair with joy. These performances were more than entertainment. They were acts of defiance against the darkness of war itself. The Tadong Bridge Exodus, Korea, December 1950, winter in Korea, 1950. The air was bitterly cold, but the chaos of war burned hotter than any fire. After early victories, US and United Nations troops had advanced deep into North Korea. But when Chinese forces entered the war, the tide turned violently. Armies retreated in the longest withdrawal in American military history, and civilians were caught in the deadly storm. On the 4th of December, thousands of desperate refugees attempted to cross the shattered remains of the Tadong Bridge. The photograph of this moment is almost unbearable. Families inching their way across broken beams, balancing above icy waters, clutching children and whatever belongings they could carry. Each step was a gamble between survival and death. It is a portrait of human resilience, but also of profound tragedy. Behind every face was a home abandoned, a loved one lost, a future uncertain. These were ordinary people forced into extraordinary peril by the decisions of distant leaders and the brutality of war. The destroyed bridge became more than just a crossing point. It was a symbol of how fragile the line between life and death had become. For many, it was the last bridge they would ever walk. John F. Kennedy, The Final Smile, Dallas 1963. The photograph is deceptively ordinary. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, smiling and waving from an open-top car as it glides through the streets of Dallas. Crowds cheer, faces beam with excitement, flags wave in the Texas Sunday. It looks like a perfect moment of connection between a leader and his people, but history froze this frame in chilling irony. Just minutes later, the sound of gunfire would shatter the celebration. The cheers would turn to screams, the waving flags to frantic chaos. The world would watch in shock as Kennedy's motorcade became the scene of one of the most infamous assassinations of the 20th century. This photograph has since become one of the most haunting in American history. It shows a man at the height of his charisma, unaware of the tragedy awaiting him around the corner. His smile carries both warmth and fragility, reminding us how quickly history can pivot from light to darkness. Looking at it now, we don't just see a president, we see the fragility of life itself, how destiny can change in the span of a heartbeat. Mercy on the Battlefield, Korea, 1951. The Korean War was one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century, a collision of ideologies fought with human lives. In 1951, amid the frozen hills and shattered villages, a haunting photograph captured a moment of desperate humanity. Chinese soldiers on their knees, pleading for mercy before Korean troops. Their faces reveal exhaustion, fear, and surrender. Just hours earlier, they might have been fierce opponents on the battlefield. Now, stripped of weapons and strength, they were simply men begging to live another day. For those who see this image today, it is unsettling. War is often portrayed in terms of victory, strategy, and honor. But here, all that falls away. What remains is the raw, fragile truth. Even soldiers, trained to kill, carry the same instinct as any of us, the will to survive. This photograph forces us to confront the paradox of war. Enemies by command, humans by nature. On that battlefield, in that moment, mercy was not just a choice, it was a test of humanity itself. Fire in the sky, Mount Vesuvius and war, 1944. In March 1944, the skies over Italy carried two kinds of destruction, one born from nature, the other from man. Mount Vesuvius, the same volcano that had buried Pompeii centuries earlier, roared back to life. Lava poured down its slopes, ash darkened the horizon, and villages trembled beneath its fury. And then, as if nature's wrath wasn't enough, American B-25 bombers soared overhead. A photograph captured the surreal scene, the fiery eruption below, the engines of war above. Two disasters, one ancient, one modern, collided in a single moment, frozen in history. For soldiers and civilians alike, it must have felt apocalyptic. Imagine standing on the ground, watching rivers of fire consume homes while the roar of bombers shook the sky. Was the world ending by Earth's hand or humanity's? No answer could ease the terror. This image is more than just a record of coincidence. It is a reminder of how fragile we are, caught between forces beyond our control. Whether from the depths of the earth or the ambitions of nations, destruction often arrives without warning and leaves behind scars that last generations. The Shah's Guards, power in leopard skin, Iran 1960. In the Iran of the 1960 seconds, luxury and power were often displayed not through architecture or jewels, but through spectacle. One striking image from that era shows the elite guards of Shah Muhammad Reza Pahlavi dressed not in plain military attire, but in leopard skin uniforms. The sight is almost theatrical. Rows of disciplined soldiers, their uniforms patterned with the wild elegance of a predator. It wasn't just fashion, it was symbolism. The Shah wanted his guard to embody strength, dominance, and prestige. The leopard, fierce and untamed, became the chosen image of authority. But beneath this carefully crafted appearance lay the fragile reality of a nation in turmoil. While the guards paraded in lavish attire, poverty and unrest simmered in the streets. The leopard print projected an image of timeless rule, yet history would soon prove how unstable that power truly was. Less than 2 decades later, the monarchy would collapse in the storm of revolution. This photograph is a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. What looks powerful in the moment may, in hindsight, reveal itself as fragile theater, an empire dressed in leopard skin, standing on borrowed time. Albert Einstein, The Quiet Before Farewell, 1955. In March 1955, a quiet photograph was taken inside a modest home in Princeton, New Jersey. It shows Albert Einstein, the man whose name had become synonymous with genius, seated in his study, surrounded not by adoring crowds or flashing cameras, but by the silence of his final days. His hair, famously wild, was now thinner and grayer, his body frail, his face weary. Yet his eyes still carried the spark of endless curiosity, the same light that had once rewritten humanity's understanding of the universe. Just a month later, Einstein would pass away. But this image is not one of defeat. It is a portrait of peace, of a man who had given his life to questions larger than himself. He had unlocked mysteries of time, space, and energy, yet in his final years, he lived simply, quietly, with books and thought as his closest companions. This photograph is haunting in its ordinariness. The greatest scientific mind of the century did not leave this world in a laboratory or at a podium, but in the stillness of his own home. It reminds us that even legends return, in the end, to the simplicity of being human. Painted veins, beauty in 17th century England. 17th century England was an era obsessed with appearances. Pale skin was the ultimate symbol of aristocracy, proof that one did not toil under the sun like common laborers. But the fashion went beyond paleness alone. To elevate their beauty, women of high status often took blue pencils and carefully drew delicate veins across their chests, necks, and shoulders. At first, the idea seems bizarre, even grotesque. Why would anyone want to make their skin appear almost transparent, marked with veins? But to the eyes of the elite, these painted lines emphasized fragility, refinement, and above all, wealth. They whispered, "I am so noble, my skin is as thin as porcelain, I am untouchable." This strange ritual highlights how beauty standards are not eternal truths, but cultural inventions. What one age sees as attractive, another may find absurd. Yet the pursuit of belonging, of signaling status through appearance, is timeless. Looking at these painted veins today, we may laugh or shudder, but for those women centuries ago, each line was a brushstroke of identity, proof that even their bodies could become a canvas for power. Riding the rails, Michigan's railroad, bicycles, 1910. In the early 20th century, America was alive with invention. Every corner of daily life seemed to invite a new idea, a fresh experiment. One of the most curious creations of that era was the railroad bicycle, a strange hybrid of pedal power and steel tracks. A photograph from 1910 inches Pellston, Michigan, shows these contraptions in use. At first glance, they look almost comical. Bicycles fitted with frames and wheels wide enough to balance perfectly on railroad tracks. But they weren't toys. They were practical machines, built for workers who needed to travel long distances along the rails quickly and efficiently. Imagine the sensation gliding along silent tracks, the rhythmic hum of the wheels echoing across empty fields. No traffic, no obstacles. For some, it must have felt like flying low to the ground, an adventure born from pure necessity. Of course, the design had its risks. A single mistake, a miscalculation of timing, and a rider could meet disaster if a train approached. Still, these bicycles remain a fascinating glimpse of human ingenuity, proof that when faced with a challenge, people will find ways to bend even iron and rail into something new. The bubble dance, Sally Rand's scandalous art, 1930 seconds. The 1930 seconds were years of hardship. The Great Depression had stripped joy from millions of lives, yet people still searched for moments of wonder, escape, and entertainment. On stages across America, one woman dared to give them just that: Sally Rand, with her infamous bubble dance. Instead of traditional costumes, Rand performed nearly nude, hidden only by a massive, transparent bubble shaped like a giant balloon. With graceful movements, she spun, lifted, and balanced the orb, transforming the stage into a hypnotic blur of light, skin, and illusion. For some, the act was scandalous. For others, it was pure art. Police often raided her shows, declaring them indecent. Yet audiences kept returning, mesmerized by her courage and elegance. In an era when modesty was strictly enforced, Sally Rand pushed boundaries, reminding the world that performance could be provocative without losing its artistry. Her bubble dance became a symbol of defiance during difficult times, a daring statement that beauty and creativity could survive even in the darkest years of economic despair. Today, it remains one of the most unforgettable spectacles in the history of American entertainment. Painted stockings, beauty in wartime sacrifice, 1940 seconds. During World War II, nylon stockings became a rare luxury. Factories that once produced them were repurposed for the war effort, their materials turned into parachutes, ropes, and uniforms. For millions of women, this meant the end of an everyday symbol of elegance. But necessity gave birth to creativity. Instead of going without, women began painting their legs to mimic the look of stockings. With brushes, creams, or special dyes, they carefully shaded their skin, even drawing a seam down the back of the leg to complete the illusion. At a distance, the effect was convincing enough to pass in public, enough to preserve a small piece of dignity during uncertain times. But the beauty came at a cost. The paint often caused rashes and allergic reactions. For poorer women, the stockings would remain on for days, fading only as they wore away. Still, the practice spread everywhere, a quiet rebellion against scarcity. This photograph of painted legs is more than just fashion history. It is a testament to resilience, proof that even in the face of war and deprivation, people found ways to hold on to beauty, to normalcy, and to hope. Intoxication captured 1,860 seconds, portraits of vice. Photography was still a young art in the 1,860 seconds, often reserved for family portraits, dignified poses, and solemn expressions. But not every photographer was interested in perfection. Some turned their lenses toward a different subject, the chaos of intoxication. Rare images from that era show men slumped over tables, eyes glazed, hats askew. Others raise bottles with exaggerated pride, their faces flushed with drink. In a time when long exposures required subjects to sit still, these drunken figures appear even more striking, frozen mid-stumble, caught between laughter and collapse. What makes these photographs fascinating is not just the humor or scandal, but the honesty. They reveal a side of 19th century life rarely recorded in history books. The taverns, the excess, the vulnerability of people letting go of restraint. For us today, these images feel both distant and familiar. The clothing, the settings, belong to another century, but the expressions, the laughter, the loss of control are timeless. They remind us that beneath the layers of history, humans have always sought escape, whether in art, in joy, or at the bottom of a bottle. Samurai at the Sphinx, East meets West, 1864. In 1864, long before mass tourism made Egypt a global attraction, a photograph captured one of the most unlikely encounters in history. Japanese samurai standing before the Great Sphinx of Giza. It was a surreal meeting of worlds. The samurai, symbols of discipline, tradition, and feudal Japan, posed with swords at their side beneath the ancient gaze of Egypt's monumental guardian. Thousands of years of culture collided in a single frame, the mysteries of the desert merging with the warriors of the East. This photograph marked more than just travel. It reflected a period of profound transition. Japan was opening its doors after centuries of isolation, sending envoys abroad to learn, to negotiate, and to understand a rapidly modernizing world. Egypt, meanwhile, was drawing the fascination of explorers and diplomats from across the globe. To us today, the image feels almost dreamlike, as though history itself bent time and space to bring these two worlds together. The samurai at the Sphinx is more than a curiosity. It is a reminder that even in centuries past, cultures were not isolated, but constantly crossing paths in ways that still astonish us. The turtle race, a strange American spectacle, 1,920 seconds. The 1,920 seconds in America were years of spectacle, invention, and showmanship. If something could be turned into entertainment, it often was, no matter how unusual. One photograph from this era captures two women perched on the backs of giant turtles during what was called a turtle race. At first glance, it might look playful, even whimsical, but the reality is far less charming. Turtles are not built to carry such weight. Their shells may seem sturdy, but beneath lies a fragile structure, muscles, organs, and a spine vulnerable to damage. What the crowd saw as fun was, in truth, a form of cruelty. Yet, in the context of the 1,920 seconds, this fit perfectly with the spirit of the age. It was a decade obsessed with novelty, with turning even the natural world into a stage for amusement. Turtle races were just one of countless bizarre entertainments, alongside dance marathons, carnival stunts, and jazz-fueled parties. This image is both fascinating and unsettling. It reminds us that history's amusements often reveal the contradictions of humanity, our endless creativity in making fun, and our blindness to the cost of that fun on others, even on creatures as ancient and gentle as turtles. A beachside misunderstanding, New Jersey, 1939. On a sunny day in New Jersey in 1939, a young woman stretched out on the beach, enjoying the warmth of the ocean breeze. Above her stood a lifeguard, sternly pointing at a sign. The photo captured the moment perfectly, a clash between freedom and rules. At first, the scene looks scandalous, the woman sunbathing topless, seemingly defying public decency. But when you look closer, you realize the irony. The sign warning against topless bathing wasn't directed at women at all, it was meant for men. In that era, it was men who were forbidden to bare their chests on beaches, not women. This snapshot reveals just how dramatically social norms have shifted. Today, the idea of banning men from going shirtless at the beach feels almost laughable. Yet in the 1,930 seconds, modesty laws drew strict lines, shaping how people dressed and behaved in public spaces. The photograph has endured because of its humor, a moment where misunderstanding turned into a timeless piece of social commentary. It reminds us that history is filled with little paradoxes, where what once seemed obvious now feels absurd. A lonely wait. Italy, 1932. The streets of Italy in the early 1930s carried an air of tension. The country was under Mussolini's fascist regime, where poverty pressed down on the working class, even as the state paraded ideals of strength and discipline. Amid this backdrop, one photograph captures a stark and silent truth. A woman of easy virtue waiting for clients. She stands alone, leaning against a wall, her posture a mix of patience and resignation. There is no glamour in her appearance, no attempt to romanticize her profession. Instead, the image reveals the weight of survival. For many women during this time, prostitution was not a choice born of freedom, but of necessity. The photo is haunting because of its stillness. Crowds may have walked past, lives may have carried on, yet for her, every moment was measured by waiting for the next transaction, waiting for the next shadow to approach. It is more than a portrait of one woman. It is a window into the social struggles of an era when hardship forced countless lives into silence and invisibility. Her story may never be written in history books, but in that single image, her existence cannot be ignored. Two fountains, two Americas, USA, 1956. The photograph seems simple. Two water fountains standing side by side. One is labeled whites only, the other colored only. Next to the second fountain, an African-American family bends down to drink. They are neatly dressed, dignified, their Sunday clothes crisp against the harsh backdrop of segregation. This image, taken in 1956, strikes like a wound reopened. It reveals the absurd cruelty of a system that divided people not by character, but by skin. Water, the most basic human necessity, became a symbol of inequality. The fountains themselves tell the story. One often newer, cleaner, and well-kept. The other worn, neglected, a reminder of second-class citizenship. What makes this photograph so powerful is not just the injustice, but the quiet resilience of those forced to endure it. The family does not rage, does not protest in that moment. They simply live, surviving with dignity in a world that denied them equality. It is a snapshot of a nation at war with itself. And though laws have since changed, the photo reminds us that the scars of segregation cannot be erased, only remembered, so they are never repeated. Defiance in the streets, Spain, 1986. The 1980 seconds in Spain were years of transformation. After decades of dictatorship, the country was rebuilding its democracy, but economic struggles weighed heavily on its working class. Factories closed, jobs vanished, and with them, a sense of security. One striking photograph from 1986 captures this tension. A woman, a textile worker, standing face to face with riot police during a labor dispute. Her body leans forward, her expression fierce, unflinching. She is not armed, not shielded, yet in that moment, she embodies resistance. Behind her were thousands of workers demanding justice, fighting to keep their livelihoods from disappearing with the closure of the factory. The police, armored and disciplined, represented the state's unwillingness to bend. But the woman's stance tells another story of courage that refuses to be silenced. This image resonates because it is more than just a protest. It is the story of countless ordinary people who risked their safety to defend their dignity. For Spain, it symbolized a new chapter where citizens learned to raise their voices against power, no matter the cost. History often remembers leaders and governments, but here, in the gaze of one determined woman, we see the true heartbeat of change. A Confederate captain's bold fashion, 1,860 seconds. When we think of the American Civil War, the images that come to mind are usually grim. Muddy battlefields, torn uniforms, weary faces. But one unusual photograph from the 1,860 seconds presents a very different picture. A Confederate Army captain named Samuel Richardson posing proudly in a pair of flamboyant, striped pants. The trousers, wide and patterned, stand out boldly against the otherwise somber tone of wartime attire. At a time when most soldiers wore practical, drab uniforms designed for utility, Richardson's choice was almost theatrical. Perhaps it was an attempt to display individuality amid conformity, Or maybe it was a personal rebellion against the bleakness of war. What makes this image striking is the humanity it reveals. Even in the midst of conflict, people sought ways to express themselves, to carve out a sense of identity that war could not erase. A simple garment became a declaration. I am more than just a soldier. I am a man with style, with personality, with life beyond the battlefield. This photograph reminds us that history is not only about battles won and lost, it is also about the small, eccentric details that make people unforgettable. Sometimes, even a pair of pants can outlive the memory of a war. The fire escape tragedy. Boston, 1975. On the 22nd of July 1975, the streets of Boston became the stage for one of the most haunting news photographs of the century. Flames consumed a residential building, and on a narrow iron fire escape, one 9-year-old Diana Bryant clung desperately to life, holding her 2-year-old goddaughter, Tiare Jones. Photographer Stanley Foreman arrived just in time to capture the unthinkable. As fire trucks struggled to reach the women, the fire escape suddenly gave way. In a split second, the metal ladder tore from the wall, and both Diana and Tiare plunged toward the ground. The photograph froze them mid-fall, Diana's body twisting in terror, the child clutched in her arms. Diana died upon impact. Miraculously, little Tiare survived, her fall cushioned by the young woman who refused to let go. The image shocked the world. It wasn't just a record of disaster, but a raw reminder of the fragility of human structures, of how quickly safety can turn into death. The tragedy also led to real change. Stricter building codes and fire escape inspections across the United States. This photograph is more than a snapshot of despair. It is also a testament to sacrifice, a young woman's final act of love that saved a child's life. Forging giants. Titanic's anchor chain, 1910. In 1910, in the shipyards of England, a group of workers stood proudly beside a colossal creation, 3 massive links of the Titanic's anchor chain. The photograph is striking not only for the size of the chain, but also for the contrast. The men look almost miniature compared to the iron links towering over them. Every piece of the Titanic was built by hand, forged with sweat, fire, and human endurance. For the workers, this wasn't just another ship. It was a marvel of engineering, the largest vessel of its time, a floating palace that promised to rewrite history. To pose with its anchor chain was to stand beside a symbol of human ambition, progress, and pride. Yet, knowing what would come just 2 years later, the image now carries a haunting weight. These massive links, once meant to secure the unsinkable ship, became silent witnesses to its tragic fate. The pride in the workers' faces reminds us that history is not only about grand disasters, but also about the countless ordinary hands that built the extraordinary. The Titanic's story often ends with ice and loss, but this photograph reminds us of its beginning, a moment of triumph, when human effort seemed capable of holding even the sea itself. Images, whether of miners under X-rays, children in haunting costumes, or families divided by war and tragedy, reminds us that the past is alive in fragments. Some pictures inspire wonder, others chill us with their darkness, but all of them whisper truths about the world we inherited. These photographs challenge us to look closer, to question what we see, and to remember that behind every face, every moment, lies a story that shaped who we are today. They prove that the past is not distant, it breathes through us, influencing how we live, love, and dream. If these forgotten moments moved you, don't let them fade away again. Share this journey with others. Leave a comment about the image that struck you most, and subscribe to discover more hidden stories the past has left behind. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary lessons come not from words, but from the silent gaze of a photograph.